Hello, everyone, and welcome to the gathering. It's great to have you in worship with us today. My name is Matt Miofsky. If you've never been here before, welcome. And I know some of you at McCausland particularly are thinking, what's with the video? Well, the gathering is one church, but we meet in 4 different locations around St. Louis. And so what that means is normally I'm preaching live at McCausland, but occasionally, like today, I'll go around and preach at one of the other sites live. But I'll be back with you next week. It's good to have you here, though. Today, we're ending our series, Face It, Knock Out Your Fears. And if you've been with us, we've been talking about the way in which fear can hold us back from change. And as we jump in this week, I have to say a thank you to Drea Hawkins. Drea is the kickboxer that you've seen in the video. She's a local kickboxer. And she dedicated her time and energy to make those videos, and I think they've been awesome. And so I want to thank Drea and Title Box up in Rock Hill for letting us shoot the videos in their space. But I think that fighting metaphor is an apt one, because we really do have to actively fight fears if we want to grow and change. And so every week I've been talking about a different fear. We started off the series with me talking about the fear of letting go. That is kind of leaving behind old things so that we can make space for new things. And last week, I talked about the fear of uncertainty that arises when we find ourselves in one of those wilderness times. I used the metaphor of the wilderness in the Old Testament for that weird space of uncertainty in between something old and something new. But today, we're going to move on and talk about the final fear, and that is the fear of failure. The fear of failure is, I think, the last fear that can hold us back from truly doing something new in our lives. And this really follows from last week's message. Because last week, I talked about that story where the Israelites leave Egypt, they go out into the desert, the wilderness, they cross the wilderness, and if you remember, they get right up to the edge of the promised land. All they have to do is cross the river and go into the promised land. But all of a sudden, when they got there, they became scared. They were scared to enter the new thing, scared to do the new thing, for fear that they were going to fail to conquer the powerful people, or fear that they couldn't scale the tall walls, fear that they couldn't overcome the giants. All of those, I think, can be metaphors for us. And so as a result, what happened to them? Well, they kind of got stuck in the wilderness. They never could do the new thing for fear of failing. And I think the exact same thing can happen to us in our lives. We can actually get sort of trapped between the old and the new. We've left something behind, but we can never quite pull the trigger on something new for fear that if we try the new thing, we'll fail. And that fear of failure can actually keep us from going for it. But faith really is, in large part, I think, the courage to try without the guarantee of success. In other words, faith always has the risk of failure as an option. That's what makes it faith. And so failure is actually part and parcel of faithful living. And so today what I want to do is I want to read a story, this time in the New Testament, and it's a story I love because to me it actually embodies the power of seeing failure differently. You know, most of us see failure as a weakness. We see failure as something meant to be avoided. But I think the story really recasts how we understand failure as a part of what it means to have faith. And so the setting for the story is this. Jesus puts all of his disciples in a boat, and he sends them across the Sea of Galilee. And he says, I'm going to meet you on the other side. Well, while the disciples were out in the middle of the sea, a raging storm whipped up, and they became scared that they were going to sink. And in the middle of this storm, the story begins that, like in the middle of the night, in the middle of the storm, they see something approaching them on the water. Let me read it to you. This is Matthew chapter 14, verse 25, and it says this. It says, now very early in the morning, he came to his disciples, that's Jesus, came to his disciples walking on the lake. Now when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, and they said, it's a ghost. And they were so frightened, they screamed. Just then Jesus spoke to them, be encouraged, it's me, don't be afraid. And so Peter replied, Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water. Now remember, it's storming. There's huge waves out there. And Jesus said, come. Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened, and as he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" And when they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." Now, I have to admit that this is a story that, on a personal level, has influenced me a lot. It's given me courage at various points in my own journey to try something new in my life. Oftentimes, this story is interpreted as, maybe a sign of Peter's weak faith, as sort of one of those fail stories of Peter's. There's all sorts of different interpretations of it, but actually, I think this story is a story about how we actually see failure. Or maybe more specifically, I think that the story can help us to see failure differently. And this is important because I think fundamentally the way that we knock out the fear of failing is not trying to avoid failure, but rather understanding or defining failure differently. And so I think the story teaches us to see failure differently in three ways. First, the story teaches us that we have to step out. I mean, at some point in your life, if you're going to do something new, if you're going to grow, if you're going to change, you have got to be willing to step out. This is a way of saying that risk is necessary. I mean, risk, it's just necessary. Years ago, there was a book written by a well-known pastor, and it was called, "If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat." And of course, the title almost needs no explanation because we know this truth from our lives, that if you are going to do something new, if you're going to change in some significant way, there is always a time when the rubber meets the road. You're going to have to be willing to step out of the boat if you ever want to be able to walk on water. And of course, this whole story really is a metaphor. Let me explain it to you really quickly. I mean, in ancient times, a stormy sea was a metaphor for the chaos and the uncertainty of the world. And that's just the way the world is. There are so many things in our life that we don't know what's going to happen if we try it. We don't know if it'll succeed or if it'll fail. We don't know if it'll go the way we want it to or the way we don't. There's so much uncertainty in the world. The raging sea is the uncertainty. The boat, on the other hand, is the safety and security of a status quo. And of course, what the story says is that Jesus is on the outside of the boat, that Jesus is actually calling the disciples out of the boat and into the uncertainty, and yet the disciples want to stay in that safe and secure place. And so what always amazes me is that we focus so much on Peter and his weakness of faith, but we have to remember that there were 11 men that wouldn't get out of the boat, and Peter actually did it. Here's Peter saying, "Hey, Jesus, I'll come to you." And Jesus says, "Come on, step out of the boat, come into this raging sea." And I just noticed that Peter did it. I mean, Peter didn't stop to pray about it. He didn't convene a committee or get the disciples together to take a vote. He didn't pick up a book on the properties of aquatics and the physics of walking on water. What he did is he just stepped out. And there's a part of me that has often thought, like, this is crazy. I mean, who wouldn't think about it and pray about it and welcome the input of other people and study it a little bit? I mean, why would Peter just get up on the edge of the boat and trust that if he stepped out on water that somehow it would work out? And yet I began to think that I don't think the story is saying that we shouldn't plan out the change we want to make. I don't think the story is saying that we ought to take unnecessary risks in our life. I don't think the story is saying to be silly or hasty with new directions. But I think what the story is saying is that a lot of us can get stuck in this stage where things are safe and secure. And under the guise of wanting to make a good and responsible decision, we can delay the decision forever. There's a point at which there's nothing else to learn. There's a point at which no more pros and cons sheets are going to reveal anything new to you. There's a point at which no more talking about it and no more opinions of friends and family are going to lead you any closer to certainty about this. There's a point at which all of this can become a stall tactic for our unwillingness to step out and potentially fail. And so I think Peter could have done what so many of us would do. Peter could have stalled. He could have decided to to talk to friends or ask or study or think or discern or plan or prepare or save up money or buy insurance or create a better plan. But at some point, all of that is for nothing if you're unwilling to actually step out of the boat. And what this story means is no amount of work that we do on the front end is going to eliminate the potential for failure. That at some point you have to jump. You have to go for it. You have to risk it. You have to try. You have to step out. You have to take action. You have to move. You have to actually put yourself in a position to succeed or to fail. Let me give you a real-world example of this. I remember, years ago when I was in the process of starting the gathering with a small team of people, we were so nervous. We had been working on it just like a couple of months, laying plans, and everything came together quickly. And I remember going to a conference, and I met other people who were in the process of starting a church. And I met this one couple that had been in the planning stage for like a year and a half. And they had great plans. They had studied demographics and read books and convened their team. And here we were with, 2 months in, slinging a plan together. But we were set to launch worship in like a month. And I remember I left that thing. I came home. We ended up starting worship. And it was something like 2 years later, I actually saw that couple again. And do you know what? I was shocked to learn that 2 years later, guess where they were? They were still in the planning stage. I can let you in a little secret. That church never did start. They were so stuck on planning and preparing and studying and getting ready that they never actually went for it. See, for some of us, our fear of failing begins to become for us a crutch or something that holds us back from ever actually trying. If you're waiting around to eliminate the risk of failing, then you're never going to act. But in the story, Peter did step out. And we have to as well. Failure has to be an option if we're really going to change. When we avoid failure, we actually avoid meaningful change. So the first lesson the story teaches us is to see failure differently by realizing that at some point we have to step out. Risk is always going to be necessary. The second lesson I think the story has to teach us about seeing failure differently is that at some point we will all sink. That's just the hard truth of the story. At some point we will all sink. That essentially means that failure is actually part of your journey. It's always going to be part of your journey. I'm mindful of something. Think about this really quickly. Think about who Peter ended up becoming. Peter was like a hero of the church. In the Catholic Church, he's considered the first pope. He's considered a saint in a bunch of other churches. Next to Jesus and alongside maybe Mary and Paul, he's the most significant figure in Christianity. After Jesus died, he was the leader of the movement. And so it's worth wondering why a story like this ever even got into the Bible in the first place. I often wonder why Peter didn't say, hey, let's retell that story, or let's forget this little detail, or maybe we should just leave that story out altogether. Why put a story in about Jesus, about Peter's lack of faith? In fact, if you read the stories about Jesus, you'll find out this isn't the only one. In fact, there's a lot of stories about Peter kind of messing up or falling down or sticking his foot in his mouth. Even a story about Peter denying Jesus at Jesus' death. And so I've often wondered, why in the world would this be in there? But I think the reason that these stories are in here is to indicate something to us, that failure is not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to be avoided, but rather Peter's own road to greatness. His own road from becoming a fisherman to this huge world religious leader, from becoming kind of a nobody from a small town to a person who made a huge impact on the world. The road from the old to the new was paved with failures. And what this teaches me is that in our road from the old to the new, in our road to becoming something significantly different, they're going to be paved with a few failures of our own. That failure is part of the journey, and Peter is certainly not the only one. I was looking at all these like historical examples of people. You all have read like Abraham Lincoln lost, several elections before he ever became president. Emily Dickinson only had 7 poems published in her lifetime out of something like 1,800. Thomas Edison famously was said to have tried 1,000 times at the light bulb before he actually succeeded. I love the quote that's often attributed to him. It says this. He says, "I didn't fail 1,000 times. It's just that the light bulb was an invention with 1,000 steps." I mean, what all of these things get at is that failure is actually part of the journey of doing something new. It's regrettable, I think, that we've made failure out to be a bad thing, a thing to be feared instead of a byproduct of healthy risk. But that's what failure is. Failure is a byproduct of healthy risk. Let me be honest with you all. I wouldn't be a very good pastor if I didn't say, look, every time you step out and try something new, every time you feel a nudge from God and actually go for it, it's not always going to work out the way that you think it's going to work out. It's just not. I mean, sometimes we screw up. Sometimes things happen that we can't control and that we never anticipated. Sometimes it just doesn't work. But how we react to those moments, that really dictates what ultimately God ends up doing with us. I mean, those little mini failures can stunt us from ever trying again. Or we can merely see them as a little lost battle in an overall war that we can still press on towards. I mean, don't let failures keep you from trying again. Failures instead can be lessons learned. They can be challenges that shape and strengthen us. They can be applied to the next hurdle that we have to overcome in the next attempt at change in our lives. Listen, here's the thing. New direction doesn't come from succeeding every time you try something. It comes from persevering when you don't succeed. Failure isn't to be avoided if you want to change, but rather it has to be risked and it has to be overcome. The second reality this story teaches us is to see failure as part of the journey, to remember that we will all sink at some point. And then the final lesson that I think this story offers us and helps us to see failure differently is it reminds us that Jesus will rescue us. That Jesus will rescue us, just as he rescued Peter. And what that means is that you are not alone. When you step out and try these things, you are not doing it alone. You know, this is perhaps the most overlooked part of the story, this part where Jesus helps Peter. And when I say overlooked, I mean this. You know, when Peter begins to sink, what he does is he cries out to Jesus. He says, "Jesus, I need your help." And then Jesus immediately helps him. And so often we read that and we say, well, there's his failure. He actually cried out. He had to get help. Jesus had to help him. But I think there's a lot of reasons to pay attention to this. I actually think that this might be the moment of greatest courage for Peter. Because I think what that moment teaches us is it teaches us something about what we have to do when we begin to sink. I mean, after all, if we have to step out of the boat, if we're all going to experience sinking at some point, what we do when we sink makes all the difference. What did Peter do? The story says that Peter cried out to Jesus. He realized that there was a power greater than himself, and he needed that power if he was going to continue on. And you know what? I am struck by how often in my own life and in our lives we do the exact opposite, especially when we're struggling. You know, with a few exceptions, I think it's getting better actually culturally, but a lot of us, what do we do when we struggle? When things aren't going well in your life, when you've screwed something up, when you're a little ashamed of something, what do? So often we do the exact opposite of what Peter did. You know, we pull away. We turn in. We isolate ourselves from the people that are around us. We keep it private. We try to get through it. What we don't do, at least not very often, is we don't cry out and actually ask for help. At least I don't think that's our first instinct. Yet in the story, what keeps Peter from actually sinking all the way down, what keeps that sinking from being the death of Peter was his willingness to cry out for help. And I think that crying out for help took an enormous amount of courage. I mean, there's real courage in recognizing when you need help. Brene Brown popularized this idea, and I love it. It's a simple idea that there's power in vulnerability, and that asking for help is actually a sign of real courage. Real courage is the willingness to realize that you can't do it alone. And right at the heart of the gospel, of the good news of Jesus, is the exact same truth. That if we're really trying things that are risky, if you're really trying a change that can make a significant difference, if you really have dreams big enough and worthy enough of God, then you're not going to be able to accomplish them by yourself. And the cool thing is, you don't have to. I mean, here's the secret. We all need help. Needing help is a sign that you're trying hard things. It's not a sign that you're weak. Needing help is actually a sign that you're chasing after God-sized dreams, that you're working to change, that you're working to grow, that you're working to discover something new. Needing help is a sign that you're progressing, not that you're falling back. And when some of you reach out to me and you ask me, as many of you do, for a name of a counselor or a marriage therapist or a business mentor or a financial coach or a person to pray with you or just somebody to talk to, I don't see that as a sign of weakness. I see that as a sign of enormous strength. It takes strength to cry out when we realize that we're struggling. Peter needing help and crying out for it was a sign of success, not failure. And knowing that Jesus was there and is there can give us the courage to try things that we wouldn't otherwise try. I mean, ultimately, here's the reason that we don't have to fear failure. Ultimately, the reason that we can see failure differently is that we can know that we're not alone in it. We have a helper. We have someone who has our back. We have someone that can pick us up when we begin to sink. We have someone that we can rely on to keep us moving forward. We can have a trust that even if one thing doesn't work out, it will work out in the end. But we have to realize that we're going to need Jesus for the journey that we're going on. And when we recognize that, the cool thing is Jesus will be there. I mean, Jesus is like the safety net underneath all of our attempts to step out and to risk and to change. Friends, as we close today, I want to do it a little bit differently. I know I got a lot of emails from people during this series, and by the way, I want to thank you for that. I know that a lot of you are contemplating change in some area of your life. For some of you, it might seem maybe like a small thing. I know for others of you, you're navigating big changes, some that you're choosing, some that you're not. I hope that over the course of this series, maybe you've had a chance to think a little bit more about how God is calling you to change or to grow in the new year. But here's what I want to tell you. As we look at the year ahead, I know and I hope that you have a vision for growth and change. I know God has that hope for you. And I hope that in the year ahead, you are willing to try something big enough that it actually feels like a risk. I hope that you're willing to try something big enough that it's actually worth being a little bit scared about. I hope you're trying something big enough that you know you can't do it yourself, that if you're going to succeed, you're actually going to need God's help in order to accomplish it. I hope that your aim is that big. And so today as we close, here's what I want to do. I want to invite the musicians to come on up on stage. And so often I think it's important for us to just have moments to respond. I mean, it was important that Peter had that moment where he just reached out and said, Jesus, if I'm going to do this journey, not just walking on water, but becoming the leader and the impact maker that you want me to be, I realize that right now I need to ask for your help. And I think a lot of us in this room, we need Jesus' help. And maybe some of you are stuck way back just thinking about, like, I'm trying to figure out what old thing I need to leave. And some of you are struggling with that fear of letting go of something. Some of you very much feel like you're in the wilderness and uncertainty is plaguing you right now. And some of you maybe feel like you're right up on the edge of the boat and you just haven't gotten the courage yet to step out. But wherever we are with change in our life, I think there's power in recognizing that God is here to help us in that Jesus is here to walk alongside us in that. So as the musicians play, I'm going to invite you to come forward. And as you come forward, kneel down. You can kneel down anywhere up here at the steps, the prayer rails on the side. And as you kneel down, I just invite you to ask God to help you, to ask Jesus to help you. Maybe you need Jesus to rescue you because you're sinking. Maybe you just need Jesus to give you clarity or courage to do something that you know you already need to do. But let today be a time and a place and a space where we, like Peter, can reach out and invite Jesus to help us. And so as we close, as the musicians play, I invite you to come forward and pray.